The unspoken proposition, a night that shattered my reality. Don't forget to like this story, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. I had always believed in the unwavering strength of our marriage, a fortress built on years of shared laughter, quiet understanding, and a love that felt as natural as breathing. Never in my wildest imaginings did I foresee a single, seemingly innocuous dinner conversation unraveling the very fabric of that certainty, leaving me adrift in a sea of doubt and disbelief. It all began on a deceptively normal Friday evening. Mark, my husband of 23 years, had been increasingly consumed by work lately, the long hours blurring the lines between weekdays and weekends. That particular night, he mentioned a crucial discussion his boss, Richard, wanted to have over dinner. To my surprise, I received an unexpected invitation to join them. Richard. The name itself conjured an image of polished shoes and a confident smile. I had encountered him a handful of times before, always within the sterile confines of Mark's office or at formal company events. In his early 60s, Richard exuded an undeniable charisma, a well-rehearsed charm that effortlessly drew people into his orbit. He was articulate, successful, and possessed that air of someone who commanded attention without demanding it. Yet, beneath the veneer of affability, I always sensed a carefully guarded reserve, a feeling that he operated with layers of unspoken intentions. To be honest, I wasn't particularly enthralled by the prospect of this dinner. Mark's work-related social gatherings often felt stilted, punctuated by forced pleasantries and the hollow echo of corporate jargon. However, I valued being supportive, a silent anchor in his often turbulent professional life. So, I chose a sleek navy dress, something that struck the right balance between formal respect and personal comfort, hoping it would allow me to navigate the evening with a semblance of ease. The restaurant Richard had selected was a haven of understated elegance. Dim lighting cast long shadows across plush velvet seating, and the soft, melancholic strains of jazz created an intimate, almost clandestine atmosphere. As we were led to our table, a subtle detail registered immediately: it was set for 3. "Where's your wife?" I asked Richard, a polite inquiry as we settled into our seats. His practiced smile faltered for the barest fraction of a second, a fleeting flicker in his usually composed demeanor. Eleanor's out of town, visiting her sister," he replied with an easygoing tone that felt a touch too casual. "Just the 3 of us tonight." A waiter materialized, silently pouring a deep, ruby red wine into our crystal glasses. For a while, the conversation adhered strictly to the expected script: work updates, company restructuring, the usual polite inquiries about my own endeavors. It was the kind of predictable banter that often accompanied these obligatory social engagements. But then, somewhere between the delicate presentation of the appetizers and the arrival of the main course, Richard subtly shifted the conversational gears. He swirled the wine in his glass, the rich color catching the dim light, and fixed Mark with a steady gaze. "I have to say, Mark," he began, his voice taking on a slightly more personal tone, "you're an incredibly lucky man." Mark chuckled, a reflex action, and glanced at me, a familiar warmth in his eyes. Richard's gaze lingered on me for a beat longer than necessary before he continued, his words measured and deliberate. "A woman like that. Graceful, intelligent, and still stunning at 47. That's not something you see every day." A blush crept up my neck, the unexpected compliment catching me off guard. But what struck me more profoundly was the manner in which he delivered the words, slow, almost possessive, as if he wanted them to hang in the air between us, imbued with a weight that transcended mere politeness. Mark, ever the easygoing soul, simply laughed it off. "You're flattering her, Richard." Richard offered a smile, but there was something unreadable lurking beneath its surface. "Maybe," he conceded, taking a slow sip of his wine, his eyes still fixed on me, "or maybe I'm just being honest." The conversation meandered onward, touching upon other subjects, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that Richard was steering us toward a specific, undisclosed destination. His carefully chosen words, the intensity of his fleeting glances, there was an underlying current, a subtle but persistent intention that prickled at my unease. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, a knot of apprehension had tightened in my stomach, a feeling that had nothing to do with the rich indulgence I had barely touched. That's when Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished tabletop, his gaze direct and unwavering. "There's something I've been thinking about for a while now," he said, his voice dropping to a low, steady murmur, something unconventional. Mark raised a questioning eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity in his expression. Unconventional? Richard's gaze flickered to me again, a brief but intense connection that sent a shiver down my spine, before returning to Mark. You know, as we get older, life starts to feel predictable, routine. And sometimes, breaking that routine, stepping outside of what's expected, can be exhilarating. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, the soft leather suddenly feeling stiff and unwelcoming. My stomach churned, a visceral reaction that had nothing to do with the rich food. There was a palpable weight in the air, an unspoken tension that hung heavy with implication. Mark frowned slightly, a hint of confusion clouding his features. I'm not sure I follow, Richard. Richard exhaled slowly, as if carefully selecting his next words, each syllable weighted with a calculated significance. I respect you, Mark. Immensely. And I respect your marriage, Liz. Truly. But let's just say I've always believed that certain boundaries can be flexible if the circumstances are right. A profound silence descended upon the table, thick and suffocating. I felt my pulse quicken, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. Instinctively, I knew that whatever Richard was about to utter next would irrevocably alter the course of our evening, perhaps even something far more profound. Then, he looked me directly in the eyes, his gaze intense and unwavering, and said the words that shattered my carefully constructed reality. What if? Just once. We let those boundaries bend? The air in my lungs seemed to solidify, making it difficult to draw a breath. My fingers instinctively tightened around the delicate stem of my wine glass, the cool glass a small anchor in the sudden storm raging within me. I could see Mark across the table, his face a mask of bewildered shock, his expression frozen in a state of disbelief. And in that agonizing moment, all I could think was, what does he expect us to say? A cold wave washed over me, a chilling contrast to the warm glow of the restaurant's ambient lighting. My grip on the wine glass tightened almost imperceptibly as Richard's audacious proposition settled in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Mark blinked, his initial confusion slowly morphing into something far more complex, something unreadable that sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I'm sorry, Richard, but I think I need you to clarify what exactly you mean. His voice, usually so steady and reassuring, now held a tremor of uncertainty. Richard leaned back in his chair, a slow, knowing smile playing on his lips. He didn't appear flustered or embarrassed in the slightest, as if this kind of conversation was as commonplace to him as discussing quarterly earnings. I meant exactly what I said, he replied, swirling the last remnants of his wine in the glass, his eyes flicking between Mark and me. A change in perspective. A break from the expected. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. Was he truly suggesting what my mind recoiled from even contemplating? I glanced at Mark, a silent plea in my eyes, hoping he would interject, would firmly shut down this outrageous suggestion, would draw an unyielding line in the sand. But he remained silent, his gaze fixed on Richard, processing, perhaps even considering. That silence, that hesitant contemplation, unsettled me even more than Richard's brazen words. I'm not sure what you're expecting here, I finally managed to say, my voice surprisingly measured despite the turmoil within. Richard exhaled, a soft sound that held a hint of amusement. No expectations, Liz. Just an idea. His gaze flickered between us, a subtle invitation in his eyes. You've been married for over 20 years, haven't you, Mark? Mark nodded cautiously, his brow still furrowed. 23. Richard's smile widened, a predatory glint in his eyes. That's a long time. A beautiful thing, really. But long marriages. They evolve, don't they? People change. Needs change. Sometimes, keeping a spark alive means stepping outside of what's comfortable. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the soft jazz. So, you're saying you think we should shake things up? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Richard tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. I'm saying that sometimes sharing something, someone you love, doesn't have to be a loss. It can be an experience. A sharp, involuntary breath caught in my throat. The insinuation was now brutally clear, stripped of any ambiguity. He was talking about me. About my marriage. About some kind of arrangement. Something so alien to my understanding of love and commitment that my mind struggled to fully grasp its audacity. I turned to Mark, my eyes desperately searching his face for a reaction, for some sign of outrage, some firm rejection that would reaffirm the solid ground I thought our marriage stood upon. But instead of anger or disgust, I saw something far more disturbing: hesitation. Uncertainty. My stomach clenched, a cold dread seeping into my bones. Mark. My voice came out softer than I intended, a quiet plea for reassurance. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of agitation I rarely saw, and exhaled deeply before finally speaking, his voice strained. Richard, I don't know what you think our marriage is like, but he hasn't said no, Richard interrupted smoothly, setting his empty wineglass down with a quiet, almost triumphant clink. His eyes twinkled with something I couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of confidence and a disturbing amusement. Mark fell silent again, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth, and I could feel the tension thickening around us, an invisible fog of disbelief and apprehension. I swallowed hard, the silence amplifying the frantic beating of my own heart. Why wasn't he shutting this down? Why was there even a moment of hesitation? Look, Richard continued, his voice softening slightly, adopting a tone of disarming reasonableness, I'm not trying to offend anyone. Quite the opposite. This isn't about disrespecting your marriage. It's about redefining limits. About seeing if those limits even exist in the first place. My breath felt shallow, the restaurant's soft jazz now sounding distant and distorted, as if the entire world had narrowed down to this single, agonizing moment, to this table, to the impossible situation Richard had so casually thrust upon us. Then, with the same nonchalant air he had employed throughout this bizarre conversation, Richard reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek, black card, and slid it across the polished tabletop toward Mark. Just think about it, he said, his eyes holding a strange intensity. If curiosity wins out over certainty, you know where to find me. Mark stared at the card, unmoving, his expression a mask of conflicted emotions. I didn't dare look at it, that small rectangle of glossy black that represented such a profound violation of everything I held sacred. I had heard whispers of men like Richard before, powerful, influential, so accustomed to getting what they desired that they could make the most outrageous suggestions sound perfectly logical. But I had never imagined I would be sitting across from one, let alone be the subject of his interest. I needed air. I needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of that restaurant, the weight of Richard's words pressing down on me. Pushing my chair back with a sudden, scraping sound, I stood up abruptly, my pulse hammering in my temples. I think we're done here. Richard didn't appear surprised. He simply smiled, a knowing, almost pitying expression on his face. Fair enough, Liz, he said, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of surrender. No pressure. Just an idea. Mark finally stirred, shaking himself from whatever daze had taken hold of him. Yeah, he muttered, his voice low and strained, shoving the untouched card back toward Richard as if it were a venomous insect. I think we should go. I didn't wait for him. I turned and walked out of the restaurant, barely registering the curious glances of the other diners, the hushed whispers that seemed to follow in my wake. The cool night air hit my face like a welcome slap, but it wasn't enough to clear the fog of disbelief that clouded my mind. I heard Mark's footsteps behind me, the hurried rhythm betraying his own agitation. I expected him to be just as shaken, just as horrified by what had transpired. But when he finally spoke, his words sent a fresh, even more devastating wave of shock through me. Do you think he was serious? I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs. I turned to face my husband, searching his expression, hoping, praying that I had somehow misheard him in the chaotic aftermath. But the look in his eyes, a perplexing mixture of confusion and something else, something akin to morbid curiosity, told me I hadn't. And in that agonizing moment, I realized something even more profoundly shocking than Richard's outrageous proposal. Mark wasn't just disturbed by what Richard had suggested. He was considering it. The ride home was a suffocating silence, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the confined space of the car. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if willing the asphalt to swallow us whole. I sat stiffly in the passenger seat, my arms crossed defensively, my mind still reeling, replaying the evening's events like a broken record. Richard's insidious words echoed in my head, sometimes keeping a spark alive means stepping outside of what's comfortable. A wave of nausea washed over me. The moment we stepped inside our familiar home, the comfort I usually found within its walls felt alien, tainted by the evening's unsettling events. I kicked off my heels, the sharp click echoing in the strained silence, and turned to face Mark, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Tell me," I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper, "tell me you're not actually thinking about this." He exhaled sharply, running a weary hand over the back of his neck. He hesitated, a brief but telling pause that sent a shiver of dread down my spine. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. "Mark? I don't know, Liz," he admitted finally, meeting my gaze, a raw vulnerability in his eyes. "It was unexpected." "Unexpected?" I snapped, the carefully constructed composure I had maintained finally cracking. "It was completely out of line. And the fact that you didn't shut it down immediately." I shook my head, unable to articulate the depth of my hurt and disbelief. He sighed, stepping closer, his hand reaching out tentatively. "It caught me off guard, okay? I wasn't expecting it. Neither was I. But I didn't sit there, considering it." My voice cracked, the weight of the evening pressing down on me, suffocating me. "What is there to think about, Mark? This isn't us." He looked away, a long, agonizing moment of silence stretching between us before he sank heavily onto the couch. "I know," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know. Maybe he's right about some things." I stared at him, my stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. "Right about what, Mark?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing his face with both hands, a gesture of utter weariness. "We've been married for 23 years, Liz. We love each other. We have a good life. But don't tell me you haven't felt it. The routine. The predictability." He glanced up at me, his expression cautious, almost apologetic. "It's not bad. But it's not the same as it used to be." I folded my arms tightly across my chest, my pulse racing. "So your solution is this?" "No," he said quickly, his voice sharp with defensiveness. "That's not what I'm saying. I don't even know what I'm saying. I just..." Richard made me think about things I've never even considered before. I shook my head, my chest tightening with a painful mix of disbelief and hurt. "I can't believe this, Mark." He ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "Liz, I'm not saying I want to do it. I just..." He hesitated again, his gaze troubled. "I just want to understand why the idea bothers me this much." I felt like the solid ground beneath my feet was dissolving, like I had stumbled into some distorted, alternate version of my marriage where my husband was actually entertaining such a preposterous, such a deeply offensive proposition. I took a deep, steadying breath, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Mark, I don't know what's happening in your head right now. But let me make one thing unequivocally clear, I am not interested." He nodded quickly, his eyes pleading. "I know. And that's enough for me. Is it?" I challenged, my voice laced with a bitter skepticism. "Because you keep saying you're just thinking. But what if thinking turns into curiosity? And curiosity turns into something else?" Mark exhaled, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a persistent headache. "I love you, Liz. I don't want to lose what we have." "Then don't risk it," I said softly, my voice thick with unshed tears, the hurt radiating through me like a physical ache. "Because even considering it changes things." He looked up at me, something unreadable swirling in the depths of his eyes. "I don't want to change us," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I searched his face, desperately seeking the familiar contours of the man I had always trusted, the man who had been my partner, my confidant, my unwavering rock for over 2 decades. He was still there, I could see glimpses of him in the depths of his troubled gaze. But now, something else resided there too, a shadow of doubt, a flicker of an unknown desire. And for the first time in 23 years, a chilling realization washed over me: perhaps love alone, as steadfast and deep as I believed ours to be, might not always be enough to safeguard a marriage against the insidious whispers of the unexpected. The days that followed were fraught with a palpable tension, a thick silence punctuated only by hesitant glances and the careful avoidance of the subject that hung between us like an invisible shroud. Mark tried to project an air of normalcy, diligently making coffee in the mornings, asking perfunctory questions about my day, but the unspoken words, the lingering unease, created a chasm between us that neither of us seemed to know how to bridge. I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something fundamental had shifted within him, that even though he had verbally dismissed Richard's proposition, the seed of that audacious idea had taken root in his mind, its tendrils reaching into the very core of our shared reality. And that alone was enough to make me question the unwavering certainty I had always held about our future. On Friday evening, a week after the ill-fated dinner, I found myself alone on our back porch, a solitary glass of wine warming in my hand, watching the sky bleed into the soft, melancholic hues of pink and orange. The entire week had been a blur of internal turmoil, replaying every moment of that night at Richard's house, dissecting every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word. Finally, the screen door creaked open, and Mark stepped outside, his silhouette framed against the warm glow of the living room. He hesitated for a moment before quietly sitting beside me on the weathered wooden bench. "You've been quiet," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of concern. "I've been thinking," I replied, exhaling slowly, the words carrying the weight of my internal struggle. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, the silence stretching between us once more, this time feeling less charged, more contemplative. I turned to face him, the soft twilight illuminating the lines of worry etched around his eyes. "Mark," I began, my voice low and steady, "I need to know. Why did you hesitate that night? Why didn't you shut it down immediately?" He looked away, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap, his knuckles white. "I told you, I was caught off guard." "That's not the whole truth," I pressed gently, needing to understand the complexities of his reaction. He swallowed hard, his gaze still averted. Then, finally, he met my eyes, a raw honesty reflected in their depths. "Yeah, I did." The admission, though not entirely unexpected, still landed like a punch to the gut, a confirmation of the unsettling truth that had been gnawing at me all week. "I don't know why," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, laced with a confusion that mirrored my own. Maybe it was the way Richard framed it. Like it was something normal. Something couples do when they've been together as long as we have. And for a split second, a really stupid, fleeting second, I wondered if there was something we were missing. I set my wine glass down on the porch railing, the clink of the glass against the wood echoing the sharp pang in my chest. I folded my arms, a defensive posture against the vulnerability I felt. Mark exhaled, a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his internal conflict. "Now," he said, turning to me, his eyes filled with a newfound clarity, "now I know that's not who we are. That's not what I want." He hesitated, his hand reaching for mine, his touch tentative. "Liz, I don't want to lose what we have. But I don't want us to get stuck either." I studied his face, searching for the sincerity I desperately needed to see, for the regret that would begin to mend the fragile trust that had been shaken. I looked for the familiar contours of the man I loved, the man I had built a life with, and in his earnest gaze, I found a glimmer of hope. "Then we fix us," I said softly, my voice laced with a quiet determination. "Not by listening to men like Richard, but by remembering who we are. By choosing each other, every single day." Mark's grip on my hand tightened, a silent affirmation. "I do choose you, Liz." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the suffocating tension that had clung to us began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile sense of relief. I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder, the familiar scent of him a comforting anchor in the storm we had weathered. "Let's never let anyone else define what our marriage should be," I murmured, the words a silent vow. He kissed the top of my head, a simple gesture of agreement that spoke volumes. The evening stretched on, the silence between us now comfortable, familiar, the weight of the past week finally beginning to lift. Richard had planted a seed of doubt, a poisonous suggestion that had threatened to unravel the very fabric of our relationship. But in the end, his audacious proposition had served only to remind us of what truly mattered: the enduring strength of our love, and the unwavering commitment we held for each other, a commitment that transcended the fleeting allure of the unconventional and reaffirmed the enduring beauty of the love we had so carefully nurtured over 23 precious years.